Ote, hello. 18 November. God, time flies. We're going to talk a little bit about Code of Capital today, P Store's book. And The reason why I bring it up sort of again, we haven't really ever actually focused on it. So I'm just raising it because it engages some of the same elements that we were talking about before, about the role of the superstructure argument that isn't quite a decent argument, as I tried to suggest before, that base superstructure is not always the best way to achieve kind of certain issues when we were discussing Karl Marx's Volume 1 Capital. And this is from a different perspective. This is from a legal perspective, but it essentially does what is necessary in the case of modern money theory, for example. You wanted to have more. I think when we were looking at Hudson, that a lot of the finagling was legal finagling. You know, that is establishing new ways of creating debt or offsetting capital, creating problems for capital. Liquidity problems is more about lawyers than it is about business folks, if you want to think of it that way. So anyway, welcome to This and That. And let me begin with this little bit here. I think it's Adam Tooze who does a little thing, just an opening paragraph. There's an estate in the realm more powerful than either your lordship or the other House of Parliament. One Lord Campbell proclaimed to the peers in the House of Lords in 1851, and that is the country's solicitors, that is lawyers, not barristers, but more, as it were, clerk-like lawyers. It was the lawyers, in other words, who kept England's landed elite so very well elite, who shielded and extended the wealth of the land owners, even granting them legal protection against their own creditors. Now, how did they pull off this trick? Through a nimble tangle of contracts, carefully and complicatedly applied, as Katerina Pistor explains in her lucid new book, The Code of Capital, by mixing modern notions of individual property rights with feudalist restrictions on alienability. By employing trusts to protect family estates, but then turning around and using the trust again to set aside assets for creditors so they could roll over the debt of the life tenant one more time. And by settling the rights to the estate among family members in line for inheritance. Solicitors maximize their clients' profits and worth through strategic applications of the central institutions at their disposal. That is contract, property, collateral, trust, corporate, and bankruptcy law, what Pistor calls an empire of law. And yes, it is imperial in that context. And as we recall from Hudson, that the collateralization of certain things, corporate formations, bank stuff, and particularly investment banks as opposed to general purpose banks are part of this issue. And of course, they went out of control in 2007, 2008, and they're still technically they're not back in control. We just the system managed to bandage it up, but there are elements that work currently that could fling us back into a kind of recession in the next year or two. And of course, some people won't care because they're rich people. The landowners themselves may not have understood this morass of legal relationships, this web, in Pistor's words, of claims and counterclaims, rights and restrictions on those rights. No matter, by lawyers' legal codifications, their wealth was increasing. The sort of legal logic applied in 19th century England grows only more complicated and more profit generating when the asset in question is not a hectare of country land, but stocks and bonds and shares. When an entire organization is coded as a legal person, remember Citizens United, who can own assets and who can sue through incorporation, the very form of a corporation, by encouraging risk-taking, by broadening the investor base, and thereby mobilizing funding for investments, and by creating the conditions for deep and liquid markets for the shares and bonds that the corporation issues. All of those maximize profit. And though today we live in a nominally democratic society, Pistor argues that a feudal calculus extends to our age. Superior legal coding, that is, fancy private lawyers. Using the central institutions of private law, they make certain assets more valuable and more likely to create value. For centuries, she writes, private attorneys have molded and adapted these legal modules to a changing roster of assets and have thereby enhanced their clients' wealth. And states have supported the coding of capital by offering their coercive law powers to enforce the legal rights that have been bestowed on capital. So, to end this little front comment, corporate law is no longer primarily a legal vehicle for producing goods or offering services, but has been transformed into a virtual capital mint. Nowhere is this more true than in financial services corporations. So that's the entire, post 2007, 2008 deal, and the rise of modern money theory essentially is to try to critique the kind of regulatory morass that represents. So I took one article from a convivium. People just love that Latin. A little selection of a couple of organized articles that is combined with the author, Pistor, Katerina Pistor, and on her book Code of Capital. And here's one of the kind of comment or respondents. I'll read that. I'm not going to probably get to the response she has, but you can read that. And it's very lively. I think she's quite accurate in what she wants to do. But recall, of course, that what Pistor is trying to do is to connect all these things together, but it is from a legal perspective. So a lot of it is about law firms. And law firms are corporations of one kind or another. They have complicated liability relations, and they're international, which is, I think, the important element of this. They are necessary in order to make capital work better, and not only in international sense, but also just to prop up capitalism. And I think that it's the smoothness or optimizing capability of such activity. And of course, the formation, if you want to get back to the issue of what counts as a commodity, law is a commodity, or rather, legal access and decision-making, judgments could be seen as the commodity. And of course, there's the billable hours issue, but in fact, that raises the whole front-end question of what, even though you have this really stringent kind of hourly wage or hourly billing kind of thing that comes with law, and it's just annoying, insane, and overpriced, it's kind of necessary to sort of figure out what's going on, and it's problematic. But I assert that they're in the proper hands, and that's probably the Stalinist or Leninist side coming out, is that with some things like AI, you can probably actually rein all this in. It can become more accountable at some moment, assuming certain technical things. So if we're going to talk about techno-feudalism, for example, part of the techno and techno-feudalism will actually bring some of these things back into control. Not that it's going to be necessarily serve the people. It's not going to serve a public good necessarily, but I think at some moment it'll probably be able to be controllable in a better way. That I'm being an optimist. It's getting ahead of it because it's not that way now. Political economy of private law, comment on the Code of Capital, how the law creates wealth and inequality. Note that this is a Piketty position, and wealth and inequality is the current problem of capital and inequality. Matthias Taiman and then this little convivium is a journal of accounting, economics, and law. Katharina Pistor's book, The Code of Capital, How the Law Creates Wealth and Inequality, is an original and insightful intervention in the quest to understand both the rising inequality of the last 40 years, as well as the inner dynamics of capitalism, a social formation that has ruled in Western societies for about 200 years now. Pistor shares many of the convictions of the publications in the journal, Accounting, Economics, and Law, such as the dangers to democracy inherent in the corporate form, the fact that firms and corporate form need to be distinguished, and that shareholders do not own corporations, but just their shares. In this sense, it's only appropriate to discuss and present it to the wider audience of the journal, pointing to its fundamental insights and potential for follow-up research. The title of the book and its setup to me evoke both Niklas Luhmann's system theory with its penchant for binary code, as well as Marx's Capital. Her analysis, Pistor's analysis, combines the coding of social systems and the relentless dynamic in innovating and generating new forms by recursively referring to established elements, such as Luhmann suggests with Marx's focus on the structuring effects capital has on society. All of this is making a very inspiring book, which at the same time evokes many follow-up questions, such as the reasons for the dominance of common law, the importance of public law, as well as questions about political dynamics. But before I go to these linkages, the insights they provide, and the questions they provoke, I think it's crucial to appreciate Pistor's intervention in her own right and situated in the context of the discussions of wealth and inequality in the second decade of the 21st century. Now, doing so, one sees that Pistor's intervention is framed alongside the intervention of Piketty, 2014, Capital and Ideology, who uses a more phenomenological understanding of capital as amassed wealth, which is secured and passed on over generations. Because, Piketty is looking at intergenerational long series data. This understanding of capital is crucial to see Pistor's intervention in the proper light, even though she will repeatedly return to Marx's own advanced notion of capital as a social relationship, which is what I've been yammering about for a while. Secondly, when Pistor speaks of wealth creation, there's a certain ambiguity, which at times she nurtures herself in the book between, on the one hand, the hegemonic understanding of this phrase as the actual production of wealth, that is a dynamic process that Marx sought to capture with the creation of surplus value, because the production of wealth is always at scale in this context. And in fact, if you want to look at it as the human, this is David Levine's point, that that's the most important thing is wealth production at a variety of scales. And on the other hand, a more phenomenological understanding of the creation of wealth as the durable ownership of assets. Pistor, in fact, rather focuses on the latter, that is, a understanding of wealth as durable ownership of assets, and looks at how assets are coded in modules of private law to gain priority, durability, universality, and convertibility for these claims to property, thereby gaining for the asset holder not only priority rights to the asset, to this asset, but also durability of this claim, universality over other claimants, as well as convertibility into state money. In that sense, wealth creation is to be taken literally as the transformation of claims that are easily perishable into claims that are made durable and long-lasting, hidden away from creditors and the state, thereby establishing dynastic wealth. That's the whole deal, right? That's Trump with Fred's money, and Don Jr. and Eric et al. Are going to get a little piece of that action. These assets cannot be simply taxed or acquired during bankruptcy because using the trust, they are made safe from bankruptcy and hidden from the state's view. It's these assets which are better coded than others, and thereby become more equal than others, which drive the dynamic towards rising inequality. These asset holders are optimizing the trade-off between the exposure to gain and the risk of loss. Or in her words, business owners have found ways to capture the upside while shifting the downside to others. This is just how capitalism operates. It's about, gaining profit and shifting costs. That's pretty much the deal. It's just, in this case, we're seeing it more applied from the legal context. In this way, The Code of Capital is a book that seeks to theorize rising inequality during neoliberalism. It's a book about the capacity of private law to make wealth durable and links the increasing success to do so in the neoliberal era to rising wealth inequality. The book thereby is not and cannot be about how law creates revenue growth, although it can speak about how these are capitalized. Instead, it focuses on the structuration. That's a key word there, structuration. It's a popular word in various circles. It's not structure, it's not structuring, it's structuration. It has a French thing going on. Of property rights, which permits certain asset holders to better weather the realization of adverse events. But the book also has a broader ambition as it seeks to theorize dynamics of capitalism in the longue durée. Remember, I brought up the longue durée, the lengthy period that is described by annals history historians to look at these longer sweeps, or whatever, through history that look more like Kondratiev things rather than the kind of standard business cycle that we're sort of used to. Making this not only a book that seeks to theorize the current neoliberal era, but also dynamics of the capitalist formation as a whole. See, the issue of the longue durée is to look at it more from a historical materialist point of view, that you have these long sweeps through history, and it's the smaller cycles that really make no sense because it's a much bigger thing, and that's what the Kondratiev discussions sort of imply. In this context, Pistor agrees with Marx that capital is a social relation, but she insists that it's brought about in the realm of law, with law not being a representation, but the form within which capital is formed. So this fits into the Heinrich value form deal. In her words, law is the cloth from which capital is cut. See, we're right back into that commodity deal, right, with linen and coats. This is an important counterpoint to Marx's analysis, which never fully integrated the role of the state, even though law and the enforcement of property rights are crucial for the accumulation of capital. In particular, the granting of property rights and the defense for assets and the use of contract law, collateral law, and trusts to achieve the securing of the wealth accumulated are central, as Pistor shows. Thereby, her focus is not only on accumulation through the appropriation of rights, but also on securing the gains that capital has made. An aspect which helps us to make sense both of past dynamics, but also the demand for safe assets by financial investors, as these seek to optimize the trade-off of not only increasing the exposure to gain, but also to minimize the exposure to loss. So gain and loss, right? Risk and reward, all that sort of stuff. This contribution is remarkable, and her conversation with Marx is at its most obvious at this point. To Marx's dictum, accumulate, accumulate, that is Moses and the prophets. For capitalists, she adds the desire to protect what they've already acquired. Her study suggests that whenever elites manage to tear down a barrier to accumulation, such as the lacking commodification of land, they then use the vestiges of the remaining feudal legal order to prevent from falling backward. It's the persistence of what she, based on Rudd, calls the feudal calculus, which is one of the greatest insights in the larger dynamic of capitalist evolution. That is, elites use the legal vestiges of feudalism to protect what has been acquired. By introducing the two-step dynamic of amassing wealth, that is encroachment into the commons, right? That's what's happening as Trump tries to sell off federal land to, the fossil fuel industry. and defending wealth based on the wealth defense industry of lawyers, she provides great insights into historical dynamics, which can be witnessed in capitalism. It's the survival of feudal legal remnants, feudal legal remnants, which are still in use by lawyers in present capitalism to make ownership of assets durable, where her greatest insights lie. Section 2, structure through agency. Structuration does use those two ideas as their key elements, structure and agency. So, structure through agency. The capacities of lawyering. By focusing on the work of lawyers to generate the durability of wealth for an elite, we gain a better understanding of the creation of the durable structures in which dynamics unfold. Here, Pistor's focus on the incremental steps of weaving new legal cloth for capital by recursively referring to elements of past legal constructions puts her in line with Luhmann's system theoretical understanding of law, who has insisted upon understanding law as a communication system which unfolds over time. Luhmann, you can say that his approach to law resembles some other folks from a German perspective. This stance is uniquely apt to capture the dynamics of common law, which is characterized in its evolution by its decentered unfolding. New legal structures do not have to be validated as legal as long as they're not invalidated by court decisions. Crucial here is that this process can operate under the assumption of as-if legality, maintained by legal opinions of lawyers. It is hence the claim to legality in private law and in property rights which drives this communication system forward. It seeks perfection in that kind of way. As the author points out, there's a fuzziness at the edge of property rights, and it's always at this boundary that the evolution of the system unfolds. By focusing on the work of the masters of the code, remember, the book is Code of Capital, which use their ingenuity to cloak the assets of their clients in new legal cloth, she identifies an engine in the evolution of legal forms that circulate, that is persistently innovating, seeking to protect the assets of their clients from all negative eventualities, structuring it to make it secure, and offer degrees of freedom to the capitalists, while, and this we might want to add with Marx, guaranteeing them exposure to the process of surplus value production. For a similar conception of law in the corporate form, it's a mechanism to structure the exposure of capital owners to risks of gain and loss in an advantageous way from a neo-Marxist perspective. Her insight that the legal code of capital does not follow the rules of competition. Instead, it operates according to the logic of power and privilege is crucial here. And one of the highlights of the book in Chapter 2, Pistor theorizes the historical evolution of property rights in the enclosure movement, how agents fought against the king and his notion of feudal property rights. And then once they installed the new notion of modern property rights in which something can inalienably belong to a person. There are, of course, forerunners of that analysis, first and foremost in Marx's chapter on primitive accumulation, where he not only traces the application of modern property rights systems to indigenous population with their horrible implications, but most importantly, their application to landed property in early modern Britain and Scotland. In that sense, Marx's account of primitive accumulation is very much an account of a legal revolution, whereby the installation and enforcement of modern property rights takes center stage, shielding landowners from legal obligations to their tenants and being able to dispel them from the land to place sheep there instead. These battles over time made irrelevant the relationship between the lord and the vassal inherent in the property rights understanding of feudal times, which implied that the lord must secure the livelihood of his presence. There's a kind of codependent relation. This understanding is made void, and a new understanding of the law, modern property rights of land come about. The famous chapter 24 in Marx's volume 1 of Capital, there we are again, has given rise to the theory of accumulation by dispossession, which encompasses the dynamics of encroachment into collectively held property, enclosures, and primitive accumulation by including in the realm of commodities social affairs which were excluded beforehand. First formulated by Rosa Luxemburg, this theory has been revived by David Harvey in his work on neoliberalism, pointing to the increasing enclosures of services previously supplied as a common good. For example, education or healthcare, privatizing healthcare, right? Not making it national, like whatever, or public education, now is under attack yet again. These analyses of encroachment to secure persistent profitability for capital sit well side by side with Pistor's analysis. What she adds to these analyses of increasing commodification to open up ever more areas of social life to capitalist production by accumulating the public wealth by private capital is an analysis of how the wealthy seek to protect their wealth from the vagaries of business. What Pistor thereby adds to the account of the enclosures is the inverted dynamic, which takes hold once the land is thus accumulated and secured, namely to protect it with the vestiges of the past by drawing on the private solicitors, which themselves made the law in practice in England at that time. The landed elites drew upon old legal constructs, such as the use and trust, to make these landed estates bankruptcy remote. In this vein, her investigation gives empirical material to those calling for non-essential theories of value, which point to the plasticity and path dependency of value. Legal constructs forged for one purpose at one point in time are reused in other points and in different circumstances to bring about the conservation of values. And it's here where Professor Pistor provides an important nuance to the broad analytical view of Marx, whereby the partial decommodification of land is not necessarily an act of pushback against capitalist dynamics or of social re-embedding, as Polanyi would have it, but rather of the fortification of privilege and power by the ruling elite through law. This narrower focus on legal conditions thereby provides a first, deeper understanding of historical dynamics. In essence, inequality rises if the techniques of coding are perfected and left unchallenged. Now, you could stretch this slightly and talk about eminent domain by the state as a similar kind of example. The rise in inequality becomes the outcome of the prevalence of coding techniques which lead to different strata of society being unequally affected by tail events. In this way, tail events, TAIL events. In this way, private law structures wealth inequalities and provides the foundation for accumulation. Pistor's book therefore provides a provocative answer to Max Weber and his astonishment that common law countries saw the rise of capitalism, whereas he had emphasized the need for predictability, which was greater in civil law countries. The answer Pistor's work suggests is that it is because the mechanisms of the coding of capital operate quicker and go longer unchallenged in common law countries, allowing for a certain predictability for the owners of capital. It often operates based on an as-if legality relationship, whereby constructions of law are deemed valid until found otherwise. This is how precedent kind of operates, doesn't it? If they can be based on similar prior constructs or constructions. This facet of the operation of law in common law countries provides the basis for the claim of the structure-generating agency of lawyers acting as agents of capital, an activity into which this book is so superbly provides insights. It is Pistor's claim that these capacities of private lawyers to protect their clients' capital have been amplified by the form globalization has taken over the course of the last 50 years, allowing them to weave new legal cloth, which make many of these assets unreachable for creditors and the state. So you could say that some element of offshoring finance and capital has certain property relations also in this context. Number 3, the global dimension of the empire of law in the neoliberal era. Pistor's most important point is that the coding of capital over the last 50 years has been globalized in such a way that allows entrepreneurs to choose to incorporate in any jurisdiction, as the incorporation theory of the corporate form was undermined over the years, allowing companies to operate in one country based on laws from another. She therefore analyzes the relationship between splintered authority of sovereigns and the private agents pushing the coding of their capital to escape both private creditors' reach as well as the largest creditor of all, that is, the nation state that provides the infrastructure for the business of corporations. The tools she details for bringing about such a plurality of legal regimes in the same physical place are the institutions of bilateral and multilateral trade treaties, the WTO, as well as the EU as a project to generate a single market. So hopefully you can see why this is happening, how this is happening, how it's growing, not receding in any way. And we can see this in BRICS, in Belt and Road, and there's a whole bunch of other little sub things that we see going on. And of course, the fascination for trying to create trade war as a sort of collateral problem. In this context of collision of systems of law and conflict resolution through courts of arbitration, private arbitration has gained ever greater importance, finding its apex in investor-state dispute settlement schemes which permit corporations to sue governments when laws are enacted. Remember, this is, Chevron, et cetera, have some quasi-connection to this. Finding its apex in investor-state dispute settlement schemes which permit corporations to sue governments when laws are enacted that are seen to infringe upon their liberty to do business. Operating at the edges of different legal systems, these arbitration schemes recall the Lex Mercatoria, or Mercatoria, the alleged private law that was used by merchants in the Middle Ages in Europe to solve legal disputes that went beyond one legal order. And I think Adnan may have mentioned this in regards to his Crusade era stuff. And yet, as Pistro points out, these private arbitration courts are insufficient, as there is a need for their rulings to be backed up by the power of a state. Here, her argument is that the realm of private law, dominium, has liberated itself from the reach of the sovereigns, the imperium. Using the Anglo-Saxon legal systems of England and New York State, it has globalized the legal protection of the trust scheme that was initially invented to protect crusading knights' estate from the reach of the king and made it accessible to business owners globally. The fact that it is these two and not any other jurisdictions could be further theorized in the book, while the connection to the fact that New York City and London are financial centers, and that hence in an era of financialized capitalism, it is these two which are responsible for 57% of transnational business transaction. The question remains to what degree we are actually observing a path-dependent process, which has to do with the fact that it is not simply any state which could guarantee the pacta sunt servanda for these contracts, but that there is indeed something more specific about these two. Note, of course, let me break here for a second and note that that was an important element of the Michael Hudson book about talking about the difference between the London and New York branches of various businesses. In this context, it would be interesting to further pursue the metaphor of the empire of law and to inquire into its link to the actual British Empire and its former colony. It would have been worthwhile to link the British colonial rule to the remarkable predominance of English law globally, making up 40% of the total. Having established the predominance of these two systems further strengthens Pistor's claim about the preponderance of Anglo-Saxon common law in the current phase of globalization, but it would have invited further inquiry into the role of the legal profession in these countries and its impact on the evolution of law, as well as the interaction between private and public law. As pointed out by her, judges in these countries are selected from the bar, which she suggests that these former practitioners are more inclined to accept legal innovations than in code law countries, where judges sit at the apex of the professional hierarchy and are rather distinct from practicing lawyers. She points to the power of private solicitors in the UK in the 19th century, defending the use of feudal contractual constructs to shield the assets of the powerful from outside interference. And for 21st century capitalism, she points to the increasing role of out-of-court settlements, which allow the masters of the code to operate in an as-if kind of legal reality, as legal constructs are not explicitly ruled out. Her book, in this sense, does shed light on the interaction between public and private lawmaking, but it traces these developments stemming from private initiative. Now, but what is the role of public agents, of public law and state attorneys? Is there really only constrained space for action to limit the negative consequences of private contractual law for the public? One is left to wonder whether there is no movement within the legal profession against the undermining of public power in the U.S., i.e., or for example, regarding the capacity to tax. And if it exists, how does it find its expression in the interpretations of existing laws and its impact on lawmaking by parliaments? Pistor uses the image of the traffic lights to visualize public law, which has to be aligned to allow private interests to expedite the pursuit of their interests, and which are aligned due to pressure on lawmakers. This shows that public decision-making can be indeed a hindering block for private initiative of asset holders, but the book does not trace the impulses that limit this kind of encroaching behavior on the public side. In other words, in this book, we learn a lot about private law and how private lawyers have interacted with public lawmakers to make sure that all the lights are green, but we learn little about public law in the historical episodes when the relationships between the two were actually fundamentally changed. This was the case in moments where the reassertion of state authority occurred, such as in the evolution of antitrust legislation in the 1890s in the US, which was carried by a large populist movement. Similar attempts, albeit at a much smaller scale, occur today to gain a grip on the tax evading behavior by US citizens and corporations were made by lawmakers in the US in the wake of the financial crisis of 2008, when the US used its reach, as Hudson refers, used its reach beyond its borders in the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act to force U.S. citizens to declare and pay their taxes in the U.S. These attempts to limit dominium by imperium, that is, to limit private law with the help of public law, indicate a beginning reversal of the neoliberal triumph that Pistor's book describes, which from its right beginning sought to limit imperium in order to have dominium rule supreme. Now, it's here where we might need more understanding of the factors which are driving these momentous changes between public law, and private law that the book leave a bit of a lacuna, that is a gap, making it able to generate an account that explains the movement towards the neoliberal apex of private interests being placed above public ones, but providing the reader with an insufficient understanding for when the pendulum might swing in the other direction. It won't, or whatever. For that to occur, we need to shed more light on the sphere of interaction between public and private law, looking at it from the angle of how public law curtails private prerogatives. Here, her brief account of the shift in property rights in 1881 indicates that it is the unsustainability of the prior debt regime and its very negative effect on agricultural production in the 1870s, which was an important factor. The shifting applicability of the Code of Capital to different asset classes. Once one appreciates the evolutionary understanding of the law that draws upon prior elements and couples it with power and class dynamics in society, the question about the factors that bring about a change of the applicability of modules to different classes of assets comes into clear relief. As Pistor points out at the beginning of the book, the analysis offered in this book will show that the metamorphosis of capital goes hand in hand with grafting the code's module onto ever new assets, but also from time to time stripping some assets of key legal modules. While this goal is achieved in a very laudable way, there's a certain lack of synthesizing and theorizing regarding the dynamics which are responsible for the shift to which assets the Code of Capital is applicable. In Luhmann's vocabulary, we're observing a reprogramming of where the codes are applicable, but the question of how these tectonic shifts in the programming of the code themselves could be understood, all that remains open. That is, which factors explain the expansion and limitation of the code of capital to different raw material over time. Here, Peace drives emphasis on the constant, persistent incrementalism that is entailed in the practice of weaving new cloth based on the legal modules of the past by her ever-innovating masters of the code is important, but insufficient. As her example of the 1881 change in the validity of trust to protect landed estates shows, these legal modules are undergirded by power relationships, that is, power in law, which requires changes in power relationships to be undone. How this happened in this case is extremely insightful. After a crisis of the 1870s, remember there were panics in the 1870s, et cetera, as well as revolutions in Europe, blah, 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 showed the unsustainability of the protection of landed estates from bankruptcy proceeding, shielding them from creditors. The new Parliament of 1880, which for the first time did not have a majority of landowners in it, decided to change the applicability of the code. It was hence a societal crisis based on the unsustainability of the then current debtor-creditor arrangements protecting one class of asset holders over others, which brought change to protections of landed property in the UK. Would it be correct to argue that the crises of agricultural production brought about by a lack of investment due to overly generous debtor protection brought about that change in laws in 1881? This question has important implications as we're trying to understand the fate of the current era of neoliberalism, which seems to suffer from similar problems of unsustainability. See 2008. Number 5, revisiting the political economy of law by asking who is made whole and who is set to lose in moments of crises. Peace places the analytic attention on the distribution of the materialization of losses rather than gains. In this sense, her approach holds the promise to provide us with a better understanding of the current dynamics of widening wealth inequalities over the last 2 decades. Dynamics which can best be summarized as heads they win, tails we lose. That's very Trumpian. But when looking at this new constellation that emerged since 1970 and which came to fruition since 2000, what can and cannot be explained by Peace account? In a sense, this question also relates to the broader issue and how far her account can, at the same time, accommodate general dynamics and the historical specificity of the neoliberal era, which is peculiar. Today, in the neoliberal era, inequality is enshrined in an institutional configuration of splintered state authority and crisis-prone finance as the main driver of growth, making inequality not only self-sustaining, but actually self-propelling. This is the case because we're living in an era of financial dominance where central banks are underwriting financial markets' tail risks, countering the decline of asset values through central bank purchases of assets. That's what Hudson was talking about. Central banks are doing so as they are seeking to maintain the stable flow of credit to the economy and are seeking to generate welfare effects that are supposed to stimulate the economy through expanding demand. This is how quantitative easing partially is supposed to work. Today, it seems that we can state with certainty that these interventions mostly only benefit the top 1% who see their financial wealth reconstituted despite financial crashes, further contributing to rising inequality. By pumping up banks and creditors and making sure shareholders and debt investors are made whole, when an unexpected future arrives, the current institutional constellation cements and propels existing inequalities. That's Hudson's conclusion. To better understand how this institutional edifice of present-day capitalism was erected and how might it change, we need a deeper understanding of what motivates state action, which Peace empirical work shows to be of crucial importance for the evolution of coding practices. But her theoretical work does little to incorporate. This is a great pity, because the sovereign not only enforces contract and property rights, but is also the agent providing the main material in which wealth today is stored, namely state debt, MMT, pointing to the quintessential hybridity of private and public agents in the constitution and preservation of wealth. When Peace points out how private lobbying extended the safe harbor provision, which allows repo creditors to secure the assets they had accepted as collateral in case of bankruptcy of the debtor, and which initially applied for Treasury securities only to other assets that were used as collateral for repossession. She downplays the shared interests of the U.S. and the EU, which aligned with interests of finance to push for financial deepening. It is the shared interest of states and finance for financial market deepening, and the provision of instant liquidity brought with it the expansion of infrastructural power of finance, which underlies central bank action today. It is, however, very likely that these different but joint interests are going to clash given the rising indebtedness of states. In this context, I'm wondering whether there's any likelihood that the current institutional configuration will be reversed and that asset holders, which are protected both by private law and the configuration of financial capitalism, which secures their wealth in financial markets based on the systemic importance the latter have gained for the conduct of public policy, will be robbed of these prerogatives, reversing the heads who win tails you all lose configuration. Could it be that the instability of finance and the persistent necessity to bail out market-based finance by central banks, both in 2008 and in 2020, might lead to a rethinking of the current prerogatives of private asset holders? Easter is uncertain over whether such change can really occur. Her main point, based on Hegelian philosophy of rights, is that property not only bestows rights, but also duties upon those who hold them. With Menke, she maintains that all rights need to be assessed in light of other people's rights, that they need to be reflexive. They have social relations in that sense. The problem with an open repoliticization of economic and social life, whereby legal change results from an open political process, is that altering existing rights of asset holders will be fought against as expropriation, and hence require recompensation, much like the slavery holders were recompensated when their prerogatives were abolished. As she sees these sums to be astronomical, she ends her book with a plea for persistent incrementalism, chipping away at the edge from capital assets, empowering non-capital holders as the way forward against the persistent incrementalism in the realm of private law driven by the masters of the code. But at this point, it remains unclear who's to push for it and how. It seems to remain a very idealistic proposal, as the driving force animating such action is missing. Whereas the masters of the capital are paid very well to protect their clients, can the public muster comparable pay to motivate lawyers to limit these privileges? Seeking to repoliticize the question of to what the ownership of capital actually obliges is an important matter, and Pistor is right to point to the dangers of either violent revolutions or the slow demise of the legitimacy of law to justify the ordering of society, which is likely to occur if trends toward inequality persist. If law is replaced by naked power, it might make us all worse off in the process. But pinning one's hopes on an incremental process of chipping away at the edges of capital's prerogatives to stop this process seems to me to be no credible solution either. After all, one might be left with the joke she shares at the end of the book, whereby two peasants asked about how to get to Dublin answer, "Not from here." All right, so that's, Matthias Timon's bit at a joke. And let me quickly spool through, and you can look at it at your leisure. There is a PowerPoint that comes with this stuff, and that is on the Code of Capital. That is, not only is land coded, firms are coded, debt is coded, but as we know, know-how, knowledge is coded. The conception of law is, the modern nation state is centralized, the means of coercion. But it does not follow that access to the means of coercion are also centralized. This is that problem of law. Who can afford it in that sense? The legal system institutionalizes access to the means of coercion. Who, how, and for what purpose? She describes the different legal access channels, and we've seen that in operation with, for example, Trump, the difference between public and private, et cetera, and venues at all. Also, private versus private, that is, ways in which you can negotiate results, that is, standing rules, permissible claims, and available remedies, and the move towards arbitration as opposed to court action. And then the question of what counts as property. There is, of course, the land as the obvious thing, but then there's also the question of use and the connection of the use value, that is, expectations of going concern or probability of realizing expectations, and of course financial assets. And she does a little chart here to show how agricultural land went totally south in Britain, since the Industrial Revolution. Housing has gained now that we try to get more people to own stuff. And then there's, of course, other domestic capital and net foreign capital, which is conglomerated in the 21st century. And then she quotes from Bernard Rudin, traditional concepts of the common law of property were created for and by the ruling classes at a time when the bulk of their capital was land. Nowadays, the great wealth lies in stocks, shares, bonds, and the like, and it's not movable, but mobile, crossing oceans with the touch of a keypad in the search for a fiscal utopia. In terms of legal theory and technique, however, there's been a profound, if little discussed, evolution by which the concepts originally devised for real property, that is, for land, have been detached from their original object, only to survive and flourish as a means of handling abstract value. This is that fictitious capital that Marx talks about. The feudal calculus lives and breathes, but its habitat is not land, but wealth. And then comments on, how law is malleable, how assets have changed, and there are different subclasses, tangible versus intangible, and how they've become much more complex. And also private access to coercion is now leveraged in terms of capital. Also, the issue that global financial centers have a control on code, discussion of the code, and talking about compensation. I think she does this just to freak lawyers out, I think. Global law firms and conventions and conflicts and foundations. And of course, there's always a question of capital, what counts as capital. And then finally, the concluding thought, takes a legal system or two to code capital. Economy based on private initiative depends on adaptive or malleable law. Property law has long been a prerogative of the territorial nation state, constrained by, of course, location. Yet not all assets have a location. Digital economy in tension with analog property rights, globalization of intellectual property rights, as we've seen in the large-scale trade, TPP, et cetera. Expansive protection of private property rights constrains states, that is, no expropriation without fair market compensation, and protection of expectations affects future change. And finally, strategic interventions using the playbook of capital. Playbook of capital. Anyway, so I've included her set of comments on the other folks, and acknowledging, of course, that she didn't get to all the things she wanted to get to, and I assume her next book will have all of that, et cetera. Okay, I'm done yakking. I assume that I've haven't driven everyone away. Well, let me thank you for your attention. I will put in the link and ask if there are any comments or brickbats, etc. Seeing none, I will return us to our regularly operating